You're holding position. The situation is stable. Tonight's military sci-fi story moves carefully and quietly, perfect for sleep. I was told I should start with the objective, as if putting clean words around it will make any of this easier to hold. The objective was simple enough to state. Track a seismic signature we had seen before, shadow it across a planet nobody had named yet, determine whether the place was where the enemy began or just another step in whatever path it was carving through the stars. On paper, that was all it was. A tracking run. Limited footprint, low engagement profile, in and out with data. No heroics expected, none encouraged. The kind of assignment you give to a platoon that has done this too many times and can still do it without shaking. I remember the planet before I remember the faces. The night side was all we cared about, a hemisphere in permanent darkness, lit only by distant stars and the sharp glare of our own lamps. The crust had been heated and fractured so many times that it had turned into something like glass. We moved over black ridges that reflected our lights back in thin, jagged lines. The ground flexed under us in shallow groans, like we were walking on old scar tissue that had never healed properly. The air was thin and corrosive. My suit filters tasted it as a sour note in every breath, a constant reminder that the exoskeleton was more than armor. It was an artificial environment standing between me and a fast, chemical kind of suffocation. Every movement was accompanied by the quiet hydraulics of grav assist, compensating for low gravity and bad footing. Underneath us, the seismic map showed the thing we had come for. We called it an engine because machine sounded too small. A column of motion, kilometers long, moving in segmented pulses through the crust. We had seen the pattern before, on another world where the ground had cracked and one of these things had pushed its head up under a besieged city. It had disgorged constructs that folded out of its flanks like knives opening, and by the time we'd forced it back down with enough firepower to cripple a fleet, there had been nothing left on the surface worth protecting. That was the context. That was why Command wanted to know whether this new world was a birthplace or a relay point. If it was the source, there was a fantasy of striking some kind of route. If it wasn't, then it meant the enemy had more layers, more depth. I don't think anyone in our platoon believed in the route fantasy, but we moved anyway. My role was the same as always, recon sapper. I walked near the front, slightly aside from the main column, watching the terrain profile, watching the tremors, placing beacons where the ground felt least trustworthy. My implants ran the sensor feeds across my visual field in a constant overlay, stress gradients, density anomalies, the low red glow that traced the engine's course below. We moved along the ridgeline for hours with that dark river under us. Communications were tight, mostly status bursts and short-range telemetry. Long-range relays back to orbit flickered every time static rolled across the horizon. It looked like a curtain made of faint light, sweeping slowly from left to right, leaving a crackle in the suit frame and a temporary haze in the optics. The platoon had been split from the start. Overwatch squads along the high ground, reaching elements designated to go down when we found a suitable access point near the engine's path. The idea was to plant deep sensors along its flanks, maybe slip some charges into structural joints, see how it reacted. Nobody said the word boarding. That would have implied control. This was more like throwing probes into a moving grinder and hoping they transmitted something before they were annihilated. The first sign that the plan was wrong came as a change in rhythm. I felt it in my spine before the implants flagged it. The regular, pulse-like motion of the engine below us faltered, then accelerated. The red column on my overlay thickened and started rising. The ground answered. The ridge we were on trembled. Stress lines flared across my display faster than the software could color them. Our exosuits tried to compensate, but gravity and geology did not care about calibration. The ridge face ahead of us fractured along a diagonal seam and began to shear away. Reports came in as clipped status flashes, Footing lost, anchor lines deployed, partial slides. Somewhere along the formation, a full section of the ridgeline broke loose. I saw it in peripheral vision as a black slab peeling away into the chasm. Figures scrambled on it, their suit lights skating over glass as they clawed for holds. The gap left behind exposed a vertical drop into darkness with the faint glow of molten seams far below. At the same moment, the ground under my team went hollow. The tremor passed under us like a rolling muscle, and then the surface simply wasn't there anymore. My boots kicked at nothing. The exosuit's grav motors screamed as they tried to arrest the fall, but there was no reference plane to push against. We fell through a collapsing crust into a shaft that had not existed a second before. The fall wasn't clean. Layers of material tore past us, some hitting, some scraping. Slabs of half-melted glass and metallic ribs, pulverized debris turning into dust clouds. My visor filled with fragments and static. I felt impacts against the armor, felt the suit redistribute force and inject stabilizing compounds into my bloodstream. We hit an angled surface hard enough to drive the breath out of me, bounced, then slid. The suit did its best to treat a half-vertical channel like a ramp, converting downward velocity into a controlled grind. Sparks spat from my shoulder plates. My left leg took a twist that sent a familiar pain up through the old fracture lines. When we finally thudded into relative stillness, the world had changed. The open shaft had closed behind us. The light from above was sealed off by shifting structures. My internal map updated with a painful delay, then admitted it had nothing reliable to offer. We were inside the engine, or at least inside something that belonged to it. The walls around us were not rock. They were a composite of dark metal and grown material, ribs and panels and cable-like strands that flexed with a slow, muscular motion. The floor under my hands vibrated in a way rock never does, a controlled, cyclic resonance. Suit indicators showed multiple contacts nearby, but the geometry didn't make sense. Corridors branched and folded back on themselves, levels stacked at impossible angles. The engine was moving while we were inside it, and its internal layout was not static. Status checks came through in fragments. Some of the team were alive and close. Others had dropped into adjacent spaces, separated by shifting bulkheads. One identifier winked out as its telemetry spiked, then went flat. I didn't dwell on that. I focused on my breathing, on the pain in my ribs, on the slow adjustment of the exosuit as it recalibrated for a moving frame of reference. Above, on the surface, the rest of the platoon was still fighting its own collapse, though we only caught glimpses of that. Snatches of reports about anchors failing, exosuits sliding along glassy slopes, distant shapes emerging from new fissures. The engine had not just risen, it had reconfigured the ground to shake us loose. We tried to move. Our plan, born on the ridge, had been to approach the engine's flank carefully, find a relatively stable point to plant sensors, perhaps cut a small access hole. Now we were far past that, adrift inside a machinery that had rearranged us as easily as it rearranged stone. I took the lead by habit. My implants were tuned for structural mapping. I pinged the walls with low-power pulses, compiled the echoes into a crude volumetric image. It looked like the inside of a rotating drill filled with branching cavities. The nearest potential path upward curved around a central void where vibration was strongest. We advanced in short bounds, one at a time, boots magnetizing when they found purchase on suitable material. The corridors moved around us, twisting slowly, as if the whole structure was taking a breath. Panels slid open ahead, then closed behind, leaving no trace of joints or seams. The first casualty came when a corridor tightened. The walls flexed inward with a sudden jerk. One of the team was between bulkheads when they snapped shut. His suit took the initial crush, but my display showed armor integrity plummeting, internal pressure spiking, then venting. There was no time to reach him before the structure shifted again, and he was simply gone, absorbed into the wall. We kept going. There was no alternative to movement, but waiting for the next adjustment. As we climbed, the vibration in the bones of the structure intensified. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, like a code tapped out in subsonic pulses. My implants picked it up and tried to make sense of it. Normally, they filtered structure-borne noise, but there was so much of it that the software flagged it as possibly meaningful. I should have locked that channel out. Instead, I opened it wider. The moment I did, I felt something push back. It started as a pressure in the back of my skull, like a hand closing slowly. The vibration resolved into discrete packets, rises and falls in frequency, precise shifts in amplitude, sequences repeating at irregular intervals. The implants treated it as data, because that was what they were built to do. They took the incoming structure-borne signal and began to translate it into patterns my nervous system could recognize. None of it was words. There was no language, no images in the conventional sense. There were maps of relationships, nodes and arcs, cycles and branches, star positions, planetary orbits. Paths traced through space over time, not as lines, but as layers in a growing lattice. I saw worlds marked only by the fact that they were no longer there in the same way. Biospheres reduced to blank nodes. The lattice expanded not outward from a single point, but along lines that matched the distribution of human settlements. Not resources, not raw energy. Us. The engine pulsed around me with each update, machinery syncing with the flow. It wasn't thinking in any way I could recognize. No deliberation, no hesitation. It was running a program that had no place for negotiation. The pattern of the lattice was clean and pitiless. The connection seared through the implants and into my head until my vision blurred around the edges. Suit telemetry went wild. I tasted metal in my mouth. Somewhere close, another team member cursed in a ragged exhalation that I heard only as a change in their breathing. I tore the channel closed. It was like ripping a cable out by hand. The pressure in my skull dropped, leaving a residual ache and a lingering echo of the lattice. The implants tried to route the overflow into storage, dumping raw pattern data into whatever buffer space they could find. I knew then what this planet was. Not a birthplace. There was no sense of centrality, no special weight to this node. It was one intersection in a network of paths. A waypoint where engines synchronized, exchanged data, refit, and moved on. We were not tracing the enemy back to an origin. We were walking along a maintenance corridor in an extermination system that had already decided what we were worth. Above us, things were getting worse. The plate ridges continued to crack and slide. Overwatch squads were scattered along new cliffs and isolated shelves. Small, shard-bodied constructs were emerging from fissures, angular, glass-skinned things that moved with insect precision. They didn't swarm, they stalked. Each one targeted the weakest anchor points, the most overloaded brace, the suit with the worst footing. Reports of falls came in, transmitted by auto-telemetry even after the human inside the suit had time to register what was happening. Acceleration spikes, then sudden stops below. Armor breaches. Silence. Our original mission plan disintegrated under the cumulative stress. There were no stable vantage points left, no safe sites to plant elaborate sensor grids. The charges we had brought to test the engine's response to local detonations were still clipped to our belts, mocking their own inadequacy. My priorities shifted with a clarity that felt almost calm. The pattern in my head was the most valuable thing any of us possessed now. The lattice, the trajectories, the evidence that the enemy's path aligned with us and only us. If that data didn't reach someone who could interpret it, then what had happened here would be just another failed reconnaissance with no strategic meaning. I rerouted my implants manually, overriding safeties, forcing the raw signal into compressed storage. That meant shutting down other systems. Peripheral sensors went dark. Tactical mapping resolution decreased. I turned off everything that was not directly tied to movement, life support, or the recording of that pattern. Pain made it hard to think in straight lines, but pain was useful. It kept me attached to the body that the exosuit was still carrying upward through a hostile mechanism. We reached a chamber that my structural scans could not fully comprehend. Every attempt to map it came back as partial, as if the walls were both there and not there, surfaces shifting on timescales too fast or too slow for the software to handle. I could see a central hollow, though, a vertical column that ran farther than my optics reached. All around it, segmented supports flexed in coordinated rhythm, bearing loads from above and below. This, I realized, was where the engine's sections interfaced, a spine inside a larger spine. If I was going to make any meaningful change to its behavior, it had to be here, not to destroy it. I had no illusions about that. The charges we carried were meant for rock and minor machinery, not for a structure whose individual ribs weighed more than a dropship. But we could disturb it, trip it, force a misalignment that might buy a few seconds of chaos. I linked with the charges we had already placed blindly along our route, and with the remaining ones still attached to our harnesses. I plotted their positions relative to the central hollow, guessed at load-bearing vectors, made assumptions I would never make in a controlled environment. There was no time for precision. Then I set the sequence and triggered them. The explosions were small against the mass of the engine, but they had leverage. Shockwaves ran through the composite material at oblique angles, intersecting with the existing vibration pattern. For a moment, the rhythm faltered. Segments slipped out of sync. The whole structure shuddered. The feeling of motion changed. What had been a smooth ascent became a stuttering lurch. Panels buckled, ribs flexed too far, then snapped back. It was enough. Cracks opened in the walls of the chamber, not by design, but as a side effect of misaligned forces. Splits exposed glimpses of the world outside, the black sheen of the planet's glassy crust, the pale glare of static storms, the distant flicker of other engines' activity under the surface. The same shock that made those cracks also went out into the planet's crust. On the surface, parts of the ridgeline collapsed entirely. Some troopers were swallowed by the falling stone, their signals gone in an instant. Others were thrown onto lower shelves that held long enough for dropships to reach them. The shard constructs lost their footing along with everyone else. Some fell, some clung and adapted. We clawed our way through one of the cracks, using magnets and raw friction. The exosuit's servos whined under the strain. My ribs protested with every move. At one point, my left leg slipped and twisted again, sending a flare of white heat up my spine. I held onto the edge until it passed, then pulled myself up another meter. When I finally emerged onto the surface, the sky was a storm of dust and static. Lightning crawled horizontally along the low clouds, illuminating jagged silhouettes of broken terrain. And beyond, along the horizon, I saw more motion. The engine we had been inside was not alone. Its disturbance had woken others. Dark shapes were pushing up under the crust in the far distance, raising new ridges, collapsing old ones. The network was active. Our presence here had not gone unnoticed. It had been incorporated. Dropships came in low, hugging what cover there was. Their hulls glowed faintly from the constant abrasion of glass dust. They hovered for seconds at a time, long enough to snatch any suit that could reach a mag clamp or rappel line, then had to lift again as the ground shifted under them. I remember being hauled into the belly of one. A sudden change from corrosive cold to filtered air. The weight of my own body as the artificial gravity inside took hold again. The way my vision tumbled. I remember someone working on the breach in my flank armor, sealing it with expanding foam and bandage mesh. Their words didn't register. Only their hands did, moving with efficient urgency. The last thing I saw through the dropship's ramp before it sealed was the engine we had left behind, still rising, still moving, only slightly staggered. The cracks we had made were already closing, the material flowing back into seamless geometry. I lost consciousness on the climb to orbit. When I woke in the medical bay, the world had been reduced to white walls, soft lighting, and the steady pulse of my own vitals on a display. My ribs were wrapped in smart bandage, my leg was immobilized. The ache in my skull had settled into a deep, low throb, like a distant engine hum that never quite stopped. They told me the data packet got out. The pattern my implants had recorded during the sync, compressed and relayed in a series of narrow windows between static storms. Strategists had already started building models around it. The consensus was that the planet was a waypoint, not a core, not a birthplace. They also told me, in the flat tone people use when they have accepted something they can't change, that the trajectories implied by the lattice lined up almost perfectly with the spread of human colonies and stations. Not just the big hubs everyone knew about, but the small, marginal places too. Someone had fed those coordinates into the enemy's logic, or it had derived them on its own. It didn't matter which. There was no sign in any of that pattern of negotiation space, no conditional branches, no permutations that included coexistence. Every path that intersected human presence ended the same way, with a node tagged as processed and the lattice extending outward to the next. The war, as far as the enemy was concerned, wasn't a struggle over territory. It was a cleaning operation. We were the contaminant. FOMO reports will phrase that differently. They will talk about non-cooperative extermination logic and zero-sum conflict structures. They will model best-case scenarios that hinge on disrupting the lattice, forcing delays, finding ways to mislead the engines about where we are. Those models might even work for a while. I am not a strategist. I am a man who has crawled inside the machinery that is meant to erase us and has felt its rhythm in his bones. From that vantage point, the only honest conclusion I can offer is that every victory we claim from now on will be measured in postponements, not reversals. I lie here, wrapped in synthetic fibers, breathing filtered air under gentle gravity, and I can still feel the ground moving under me as if I am back in that chamber. I can still sense, at the edge of perception, the pattern of the lattice. Lines reaching out, converging on worlds that haven't yet realized they are already marked. I am supposed to find something constructive in this memory, some lesson that can be turned into doctrine. What I have instead is a single, unadorned fact. We walked into a node of a system that does not see us as opponents, only as a set of coordinates to be processed. If there is any purpose in me recounting this, it is to make that clear. Not in the language of analysis, but in the tangible weight of what it felt like to stand in that hollow, surrounded by moving structure, and know that the vibration under my feet was the sound of a decision already made about my species. I remember the darkness of that planet, the way our lights carved narrow tunnels through the black, and how small those cones of illumination were against the scale of the machinery below. I remember the way the glass-like crust cracked and slid, indifferent to the armored bodies it took with it. Most of all, I remember the sound, not of weapons, not of human voices, but of stone and metal grinding together as the engine moved, a low, continuous roar that bypassed the ears and went straight into the bones. Sometimes, when the medical bay is quiet and the machines are between cycles, I still hear it. The end. The narrative powers down completely. Everything essential stays on, everything else fades away. You're safe to sleep now.